But as we go on in the story, we learn something else about hope. And we read it here in verses 21, at the end of 21 through 24. And you have those verses there on the left-hand side of your outline. Right there in the middle on the left-hand side, Luke 24, 21b to 24. Would you read that out loud with me? Let's say it together. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it, just as the women had said. But they did not see. But him they did not see. Now we see that they have some truth. They actually had some truth. But the problem was they didn't trust the truth. And so if you have something that is true, but you don't put your trust in it, then there is no hope. Someone once said that you can live about 40 days without food. You can live about 3 days without water. You can live about 3 minutes without air. But you can't even live a second without hope. And that thought is reflected here, that these men had lost hope. They were still alive. They had still consumed the facts. They still understood some things. I mean, they had the truth here. They had the truth that Jesus wasn't in the tomb anymore. They had a testimony from the women who were the first ones at the tomb that Jesus wasn't there. They had the testimony of angels that said he was alive. And they even had some of their own friends, Peter and John, had run over to the tomb, come back and said, it's true, Jesus is not in the tomb. They had the truth, but they didn't trust it. And therefore they didn't have hope. And that's what can happen to you and to I as well. They also said that it's been 3 days since then that all those bad things that had happened to Jesus. And so somehow it seems that these disciples were remembering what Jesus himself had said. And maybe they're starting to put some things together. They had the truth, but they weren't trusting in it yet, but at least they were dwelling upon it. They were thinking about it. They were wondering what it meant. On the right-hand side of your outline, on the right-hand sidebar, right in the middle is Luke 9:22. And these are Jesus' own words, Luke 9:22. Would you read those out loud with me? Let's say it together. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law. And he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. And Jesus had said that directly to these disciples. They had heard him say that he would be killed and on the third day be raised to life. And they said, it's been 3 days since all those things happened. And the women came and told us Jesus isn't at the grave. The disciples came and told us Jesus isn't at the grave. Angels had come and said Jesus isn't at the grave. We've heard all this, but we don't yet fully believe it. They had the truth, but they weren't trusting in it. And so they didn't have any hope. And I think that's what we have to ask ourselves too when we're missing hope. Maybe we do know a lot of the truth. Maybe we do know a lot of truth. But unless we place our trust in it, we won't have hope. So we don't have hope if we trust in something that's not true. And we don't have hope if something's true but we don't trust it. But thirdly, if we have only some truth but we don't have the truth, then we don't have hope either. If we have some truth, as these disciples had, but they don't see the truth, then there is no hope. Verse 25 through 27 of Luke 24. He said to them, how foolish you are, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Jesus had concealed himself from them. They didn't recognize who he was, even though he was there in plain sight. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly why they didn't recognize him, but my guess is that as we look at the context of this, it's because they didn't believe yet. It's because they didn't truly believe in all that Jesus had said. They didn't truly believe yet in his resurrection. They didn't truly receive all of that. And so even Jesus, in his own words to them, says, you're foolish. Now, this time when Jesus says you're foolish, it's not like when you and I say, oh, you fool. This word is not a word of contempt. This word is not meant to belittle them. It simply means you're unintelligent. You're dull. It's a strong rebuke, though. It's saying you're not thinking. You're not putting together the truth that you know. You know a little bit of the Old Testament, but you know a lot of what happened to Jesus. You told me that he was a prophet. You told me he was strong in power of God. You've seen his miracles. You've heard that he was not at the grave anymore. And I had told you that I was going to suffer, that I was going to die, but that 3 days later I would rise again. But you don't understand it. And so what he does is he begins to open up the scriptures. He begins to go back into the Old Testament. And he begins to teach them from the Old Testament the things about himself. And that's such an important part of understanding the Bible. If you read the Bible and you go, it's really hard to understand, then one of the things you can do to try to understand it more is realize that everything in the Old Testament was written to point to Jesus. And everything in the New Testament is about Jesus. And so he was opening up the Old Testament to help them to see that Moses and the prophets were talking about Jesus. Maybe he went back to Genesis and he talked about Abraham. And he told them the story, reminded them the story about Isaac, and about how Abraham had great faith in God, and he was going to sacrifice Isaac. But that instead of killing Isaac, God stopped him and said, I know you have great faith, but this son of yours is now going to be exactly what I promised. He's going to be the promise of a generation and generation and generation of new believing Hebrews, of new believing Jews, of a city, of a nation called Israel. And that this would provide for you the Messiah, Jesus. Maybe he talked about the Passover with Moses and how the Israelites were all in Egypt and stuck there as slaves, but that God delivered them. And when the lamb's blood was placed over the doorpost, that they were redeemed and that they were forgiven and they were led out to the Red Sea, but that Jesus was the Passover lamb. But I'm certain that Jesus probably opened up to them Isaiah chapter 53, where it talks about Jesus, the Messiah, coming to suffer. And you have those verses there also on your outline, on the top right in the side, on the right-hand sidebar. Would you read these verses with me? Isaiah 53, 3 through 5, and verse 9. Let's read them together. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Jesus had suffered. He was despised. He was rejected. He was stricken. He was smitten. He was crushed. He was wounded. He was killed. He was put in a grave. He had died. And this was all very clearly taught in the Old Testament scriptures. These were some of the truths that these disciples must have known, but they didn't know the truth. They didn't know that Jesus was the truth of who the Messiah was in the flesh when he lived with them, and now even standing before him. And so he opens up the scriptures to show them that the Old Testament was written concerning him and about him. Today, maybe you and I are very much like these disciples. We believe in God. That's why we're here. We believe that God can help us. That's why we're here. We suffer and we hurt, and so we ask God for help, and we expect Him to help us. We believe that He's up there somewhere to help us down here somehow, but we don't fully embrace the reality of His presence. We have so much suffering around us. Our world faces so many possible disasters, even present disasters. And God wants us to know that He's present to each and every one of them. So we need to know not just some truths about God. We don't even need to know a lot of truths about God if we know the truth about God. We're going to see a video right now that talks about this truth and about the hope that Jesus Himself and Jesus alone can give to us.